Welcome to panel 11. My name is Una McIlvenna. I'm Hanson Senior Lecturer in History at the University of Melbourne, and I'm going to let Meagan and Victoria introduce themselves. Meagan?
I'm Meagan Poole. I recently completed my master's degree at Monash University, where I'm currently working as a sessional tutor.
I'm Victoria Bergbauer, and I'm a PhD student at Princeton University.
So we do actually have a fourth panelist who isn't able to join us today, unfortunately, Virginie Bahus. So we will try and include Virginie's work in this as much as we can, but obviously we can't answer any of the questions you might have for her. So I'll just get questions started. The one theme that kept coming up for me in all of these presentations was religion, and particularly the role of women in religion, and this strange sort of duality that France has with its Catholic heritage and history. So much of the governments and the authorities attempts to create morality or to encourage better morality seem to be focused on either stopping religious women doing their work or encouraging religion to be more of a factor. So Meagan, yours was about religious women being stopped from teaching. And then Victoria's, yours was about pushing children, girls into homes that were often run by nuns, it seemed to me, convents. So I don't know if you had something to say about that weird, still, I think, conflictual relationship that France has with religion and morality, particularly the Catholic Church.
Well, I mean, I looked at a diverse set of institutions. So my paper came from a work that extended over 8 different départements and a variety of institutions, secular and religious. And I think what we even saw in the secular institutions, that even there where we least expected, religion became almost a structuring force. So when I looked at these delinquent girls in the second half of the 19th century, you saw how they, how even their punishment was called a pénitence, for example. So even the moral education of them, that correction, was deeply based on religious and religious rewards and punishments, both in the secular and the religious institutions. So I think it was a contested education, especially, and we see that in Meagan's presentation, of course, towards the end of the century. But it is interesting, though, how religion kept on making its way into different spaces, different frameworks, different sets of beliefs. Also, how it kind of remained that structuring factor.
Yeah, and I think in my case it's slightly different again. I think the case of the Filles du Saint-Esprit in Brittany at the end of the century is kind of one of those moments that is stereotypically representative of the relationship between the church and state at this time in France. It's kind of a true representation of this battle between, in the culture wars. Whereas I think, Victoria, kind of, it's again sort of turning that on its head once more and sort of, I guess, revealing much more the sort of complexities of the state's relationship, particularly with religious women, rather than, say, men's institutions. It's really much more a case of women in your paper. And I think in terms of my own research and the context that I was looking at here in my paper in Brittany, the questions are about the nature of religion and citizenship, and the extent to which both the nuns are French citizens and also their supporters who come out onto the streets to support them are acting as true citizens. In my reading of the protesters themselves, their claim is very much that we are citizens and we are Catholic. And so I think that's also the duality there as well. Their experiences of religion in this sort of broader climate in France. And I have a question for you, Victoria, because I was thinking when I was watching your paper, because of course my own interests are really in part about these teaching congregations and these nuns who are prevented from teaching, but also the broader sort of movement of women's congregations and their roles in sort of active social life and this sort of quote unquote sort of philanthropic work or other sort of social beneficially goals. And I thought it was interesting the experiences of the young quote unquote delinquent girls, or the jeunes libérés, and their representations of their relationships with these women religious, and particularly the negative side of their experiences. And there was a really interesting primary source that you, I think, brought up around the middle of your paper. Maybe it was a newspaper article that was highlighting the sort of, I guess, selfishness of these nuns who are running these institutions for these girls, and their money grabbing tendencies. And it was interesting. I noted the date that was, I think it was 1899, and it was sort of interesting because it's sort of, again, bringing up these sort of anti-clerical questions about the representations, not just of young girls, but also of institutional religious women. So I was wondering the extent to which you have seen this sort of broader questions about anti-clericalism and the culture wars come up in your readings about these nuns or the convents and the refuges for young girls.
Well, so I think towards the end of the century, we find them a lot, and we find them at, so for example, there was a huge outcry in the Département du Nord as well. And we hear the same kind of complaints from the public as well. There are actually two complaints, which are quite interesting because they're linked on the same aspect. The first one is, well, if you're giving work to these young girls, you're taking it away from the ouvriers, even though they are not guilty of anything and they are suffering as well. So that's the first outcry to the congregation. And then it's also very centered on money. So often the complaints I kind of encountered in my research and the press, but I do have also to say, so far I've focused on kind of administrative archives. So my research in the press, I'm still working on that. But the sources I have encountered, it's often centered on money, and it's often centered on the question of whether these girls should be paid, and which sometimes is an outcry for against this injustice, against them making them work and then leaving that facility without any form of retribution. And then we also see that on the other side, and which I think is also what the congregations, and which we see in kind of correspondence between the prefect and the congregations, to say, well, we can't give the money because otherwise the ouvrier will rebel against that, which they did more often. But yeah, so there's an evolution, but so the source you're referring to, the Edward Reich article in Département de Haute-Vienne, we see that more often towards the end of the century. Mm-hmm. But I was also in relationship to Una's paper. So in the Ballads, which I thought were incredibly interesting, and also thank you very much for singing them. So what's the place of religion there? Are there any kind of explicit connotations to religion? Absolutely.
They are, from their origins, as far back as you can go, deeply moralizing, and the most common model of a ballad, particularly one in the first person voice of the condemned criminal, closes always with an appeal to God. So it's, here's my life, here's the terrible things I did, don't do what I did. And then here's the warning. And then the very last verse is, oh God, oh Jesus, please show mercy on my soul. So they're always religious, even in the sort of more secular age of the 19th century. That doesn't change at all. There are different, we don't tend to see the devil anymore. Not that the devil isn't mentioned. There's a lot of talk of temptation of the devil, but it's a more abstract concept. In 16th, 17th century, you actually have the devil as a physical entity coming into the room and, poking the person into doing something bad. He has vanished a little. He's not there with his, black cloak and stuff anymore. But certainly people, I started to kind of keep track in the 19th century on a spreadsheet of what is the motive that the ballad writer is giving to this guy, because they're nearly always murders, right? by the 19th century. There's no other crime that really gets reported, or in these ballads at least. What is the motive that they give to a man, for example, killing his wife, which is probably the most common crime I have, a man killing his wife. And very often jealousy is a big one, but the devil will come in, you know, the devil will be part of that. So it's still a very religious mindset, you know, across Europe. That's the same everywhere. What's interesting for me of the difference about these French ones, and we go back to that point we were just talking about money, is that the Dumoulin ones, so the first really big, you know, France's first serial killer in 1860-ish, he, you know, those girls are scolded for wanting money. And, you know, these are servant girls. They're absolutely at the bottom end of the economic and social brackets, right? And they are looking for work. They're as desperate as women get, right? They're looking for, you know, work, and they're willing to walk for hours with a strange man because he's telling them that there's money, you know, there's a big house you can clean. And then he robs them and kills quite a few of them. But they're scolded for greed. You know, you should stay, maybe not with your parents, but with your master. No matter how bad your master is, stay with him. And then, and you know that we do have of the few girls that survived, who testified, some of them were fleeing terrible serving conditions in other houses, right? But they are pilloried for it, right? You should stay with your master. Because it's greed that's driving you to, you know, as if these girls are going to go out and buy, you know, super houses or flash outfits or something. They have nothing. You know, the stuff that Dumoulin and his wife end up selling is thousands, and this is why they know there's so many women, thousands of pieces of little bits of clothing, the kind of stuff that your girls, the libérés are sewing, you know, little bits of fabric, and they all belong to women. They belong to serving girls because these girls aren't traveling with, you know, loads of valuables. So it's a really interesting moral judgment to me to attack these girls for wanting to work for money. So I think there's parallels there, right? Definitely. With the way that moralizing is verbalized, you know?
I think so far our discussion also has raised the question to what extent we're drawing a line between morality and religion. Because I think we all just kind of put them together, and I think that's also because of in the archives it's so heavily immoral. I mean, that's what I saw in my archives as well, that morality always seems to, a moral education, a correction morale, would be so heavily tied to religion. So it's interesting to kind of to think also how a congregation being pushed out of a département, as in your paper, Meagan, to what extent that would introduce a new rethinking of that kind of relationship with morality and religion if it was so heavily tied together throughout the 19th century.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just thinking this question about I guess moral education, as you talk about, is really so fundamental, and it in my particular sort of context in Brittany at this time, the real question is not so much what are these nuns going to do now that they don't have any children to teach, but what is going to happen to our children who do not have a religious education, because it's unfathomable to send them to a secular school. Not only because the secular schools are not teaching religion, but because the religious education is so tied up with identity and language and other sort of cultural understandings. So that's another really big question at this time. And in my case, in reading the petitions of mothers and fathers to government representatives during this time, the overarching question is, what will I do with my child now? What happens if my child loses their soul, essentially? One of the claims is that from peasantry, or their sort of method of action is to abandon their crops. And they say, you know, in one case that we would prefer to lose our harvest than the souls of our children. So this question about morality and religion really is so deeply tied together in this case as well. Absolutely. Yeah.
But that belief that only those nuns can give them that, like, you know, everywhere else, there's plenty of Catholic parents who are quite happy to send their kids to state schools and say, well, I'll be in charge of the moral education, you know. That's really interesting to me. But I was really fascinated by Virginie's paper about this, right? Because this is all about morality and how gendered that morality is. It keeps going back to this idea that, you know, girls, and I'm afraid to say that sex education is still like this, unfortunately. I was horrified when I found out that, you know, they're taught that, you know, sex is babies. And I said, yeah, but, you know, as a parent, I can tell you that most sex is not for babies, but they don't want to talk about that. But for the men, you know, for young men, it's about how do you avoid disease, right? It's total difference, you know. And I think there's another thing, yeah, this whole thing about class as well, right? Because you've got a very rural thing going on in your case, Meagan.
That's what I was actually just about to bring up, class. So I'm glad that you did, because I think perhaps the difference between, you know, these questions about education in my context and Virginie's paper is that I think Virginie's really looking firstly at men or young boys and the bourgeoisie, whereas in my situation it's young girls from impoverished families who are, you know, toiling in the fields from you know, morning until night, and there are sort of petitions that sort of demonstrate this sort of the hard work of the family. For example, there's one fisherwoman I think I mentioned in my paper who addresses a commissioner herself, and she explains that her husband is away fishing for months at a time potentially, but she herself also has to work, so she doesn't actually personally have the time to, you know, I guess instill those sort of middle class religious and moral values into her children that perhaps others would. But in her situation, it's really, she needs the nuns to do that for her, which is interesting.
And I think also when we look at all the papers together, I think the question of space, I mean, alongside the question of class and religion, but the question of space, I think, is also a really revealing one, because I mean, of course, in your paper, Una, about that really public sphere of the execution, and also the Ballads, like being hung onto walls and taking it further, or that case in Gare de l'Est, where I'm actually almost set next to right now. But and again with the congregation also, and also Virginie's, how these booklets that were to educate these young men also were spread and distributed in different spaces and exchanged. And I think, and again, of course, in my own paper, to think about that beyond, and to think about how a person confined in a certain space is then being integrated or reintegrated into free society, already draws up a kind of dichotomy between two different kind of spaces. And I think that's also, I mean, when we look at the papers together, it's also how space becomes a factor, like a really important factor for each mechanism.
Yeah, because they seem to me to be about access to information, right? The boys and the girls in Virginie's paper are being given completely different information, you know. And the most extraordinary thing was that bit where those young men are encouraged, when they're, you know, obviously having sex before marriage, to get the girl on their lap and kind of inspect her for signs of syphilis. It's quite something, you know, the telltale signs. But the songs work in a way that as they always had in a time, you know, in the 19th century, there's plenty of literacy, but the songs get out to people who maybe still are not literate, or who don't have time to read a newspaper. And I thought that bit where they talk about the song about the little girl who's been murdered, La Petite Marthe, that the factory workers are coming out of they're still at work, right? And they're coming out and they're standing outside listening to the street singers hawk these songs, and they're thinking, oh, isn't that terrible? But you really get a sense of them at work. You know, they're not, you know, everybody's, you know, that it comes back to the class thing, that these people are working in these huge industrial places, and they can only access information in certain ways, you know. And so it's the same with you know, the poor, the girls in your prisons. I don't know, what are we calling them? Are they?
So I mean, the shift.
One of them actually wants to go to prison rather than be in the convent.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that case also, when I read that in the archives, it's I mean, from on the one hand, it's not really surprising when you read what at times happened to these comments, but I also do not want to just highlight the negativity of these places, because as I was trying to get across in this paper as well, we can't just generalize the delinquent girl and the experience of the delinquent girl. We have to see individual trajectories, individual interactions with different spaces. But yeah, so we have different forms of institutions that take care of these girls, especially because the girls, similar to Virginie's paper, where she also showed us that for girls, everything happened quite later than for boys, was also the sense, was also the way it worked for the jeunes libérés or jeunes délinquants. Institutions came into place for boys because they were a bigger group simply than girls. So girls weren't seen as much as a pressing issue as boys were. So we kind of had these like improvised institutions at times. So at first around the 1850s, so in the 1820s, when they begin to really separate the adult and the children population in these correctional facilities, and then that would happen in public prisons. Whereas when we move further in the century, we get separated correctional quarters for children, and then in the 1850, and the law I started my presentation with, the state rethinks that correction of the young delinquent and moves boys a bit earlier, around 10 years earlier than girls, into private facilities that would often be centered on the kind of agricultural formation as well. And girls would be very much present in these religious institutions. And then only in the 1860s, 70s, and those are the two institutions I showed in the Loise, we have an attempt to make a secular institution also in charge. And I found letters also of the state, the Ministry of the Interior, talking to different prefects, saying like, okay, we need to move also to take care of these girls in secular institutions. But of course, that one institution, the l'Asile Saint-Just en Chaussée, where its director was then arrested on charges of abortion, caused a huge scandal, which they tried to suppress. Yeah, sorry.
Is she carrying out abortions on the girls? What's happening there?
On herself. So as I only showed, or I sadly only had time to show a glimpse of that institution, which was extremely interesting. So it was only in place for a year, and then it was very contested because she was a divorced woman. So in the letters, we find a kind of a rumor spreading of her that she's about her loose morals, and that she shouldn't really be in charge of these children, of these girls, and that these girls would also misbehave and just be standing outside the institution dancing and singing. And then it actually came to an end a few months after a few girls escaped, which I showed in my presentation, because one of the surveillantes that is in charge is blaming her for having aborted her child of an unknown man. And then a doctor is being called to the facility and finds that she has indeed aborted. And then the last source we have from her is that letter I quickly evoked in the paper, where she writes from prison pleading for jeunes libérés to get released. But there are no responses, and we don't know what happened to her after, apart from the fact that the facility is indeed closed.
Wow.
Can you say a bit more about the financial structure of those correctional facilities? Because they're doing labor, right?
Sure.
You talked about how they're not making much money, but who's making the money from those girls? Because from the very first correctional facilities in Europe, so in the late 16th century, you get them in London and in Amsterdam. They immediately say, right, if we're going to have young people, we're going to teach them, we're going to teach them a skill kind of thing. But it's not a skill; it's simple money making. So the women are breaking hemp, which is then sold. Hemp, it goes into everything, every rope that's made in everything that's made in early modern Europe. And then in Amsterdam, the boys are doing the rasping wood, which then goes into pigment and stuff. So this is a money-making scheme. All of them are. And so I'm interested in whether they're actually making any money at this point, and who's getting it.
So the way it worked within these institutions is that so they were partly funded through the state. So the institution was meant to survive through its own financial means, which means through the labor of these girls who would similarly to the cases you just described, produce hems, dresses, different sorts of robes. And then on top of that, the state would subsidize per confined child. So not the jeunes libérés, but the jeunes détenus. So the ones that would have just been sentenced to a correction of in most cases till the age of majority, so 21 years. They would then get a price per day. So as I said in my paper, it would start from 80 centimes per day, and then it would fluctuate and actually decrease, which put pressure on these institutions, which showed also that they're also dependent on these state subsidies, and that the labor, as the Madame la Supérieure de Limoges wrote in a letter, of the children does not suffice because they're not productive enough, which also shows us that the labor was deeply central to the survival of the institutions. And then on the second point, so to the question of what kind of work did they do? I mean, from 1850 onwards, the state and also the institutions tried to change that instruction, that skill instruction, that labor, and tried to move them into agricultural working or to prepare them as a life as a domestic servant. But as we see in the institutions, and the chart I drew up for the institution in Limoges, see very similar things happening in the other departments as well, that even though that their goal is to prepare them as either fille de fermier or as a domestic servant, they fail to do so because sewing and embroidery are the most lucrative tasks. So it's mostly that, even though we do see also work as farm girls, and they would also plant, for example, their own vegetable and fruit, which then would be consumed in the institution as well, as servants. But so they would also clean and entretenir the institution. But it's mostly that kind of, as you said, money-making scheme of working as sewing or embroidery workers, which then would be moved to a local factory. So they would often also work in cooperation with a certain company or factory in the same department, and which would then sell it on, and the institution would get some share of that money made. Yeah, but in the congregation in Brittany, so because when I looked at these institutions, work was not only, when we look at the institutions, they also frame work as part of the correction. Work was meant to redeem the girl. Work was not just meant to make money, it was also the corrective force for these girls. Is that something we see in Brittany as well, in your case, Meagan?
Yes and no. I think it was interesting when I was listening to your paper, you were talking about needlework and all of these, and lace work and all of these other sort of forms of manual labor. And it's interesting in the congregations themselves, because they are, in some cases, particularly not in my own research, but in the case of Sarah Curtis and her study of the SFHS in Lyon, obviously center of sort of lace making, we see in that case the curriculum is geared towards the industry of the town or the city or whatever location it is. So in the case there was a strong push towards lace making and kind of an acceptance that these are not middle class or upper class girls that we're teaching, but these are lower class girls who are likely to work in a factory in the future, and therefore we need to prepare them for that livelihood. In the case of Brittany, in my experience, there is needlework and those sorts of manual techniques, but not as much of a push in that direction. And it's more about the religious aspect as well. The religious aspect, of course, is important across all institutions taught by nuns, but there does seem to be that sort of adapting or adaptation between congregational curriculums based on the industry of the town and what the girls are likely to do in the future. But in terms of that being a source of income or revenue for the congregation, it's unclear. It seems in the case of congregations that their sort of financial stream is in some ways similar to the sort of institutions that you've been talking about, Victoria, where there is, at least in the beginning, some level of government subsidy. but then it increasingly becomes a sort of two-tiered system between fee-paying girls and non-fee-paying girls. So fee-paying families are subsidising the education of poorer girls from the region. And in the case of Brittany, in the case of Fiji Santisbury, there's also evidence that formerly or still noble families are sort of acting as patrons for these congregational schools and for them to continue into the future. So in terms of there's a divide between the curriculum and what that actually means for the running of the finances of the school, but nevertheless, there is still some of those similar themes, I think, as well.
What happens to the nuns after this? What do they do?
It's interesting. I've been looking into this and thinking about this for PhD as well. So in the case of my congregation, actually, in the years between, so this happens in 1902, but then there's not the separation of church and state until 1905. So in those intermediate years, they kind of just go underground and continue their work. As I mentioned earlier, they had kind of lost, in the beginning, they were able to commit or open their schools based on government support to some degree. But by this point in time, that is not so much the case. And they're supported more so by local families, and particularly wealthy families in the area, noble families. So we see they become essentially private institutions that are underground and being supported by local families to continue at least until sort of 1905, or 1904, then 1905, as there's further crackdowns from the government. In the case of my congregation, the Fiji Santisbury, who I've studied, there is increased international engagement from the time of the expulsion. So there is a significant move from Brittany across the Channel into Britain, and they establish schools in London and outside of London, particularly in the south of England at this time. So they sort of find new ways to continue their schools and continue to grow their congregation. They also move heavily into the United States and Canada at this point in time as well. So that's one of their responses.
I was hoping that you guys as sort of 19th, 20th century specialists could help me, because I'm really intrigued by training an early modernist, and the 19th century, I feel very out of my depth here. It's the trend that I noted about these songs that I have in which women get murdered, and it's the misogyny that runs through the songs about those women, which is horrific, right? Lots of jokes being made when a woman is murdered. She asked for it. She was foolish. Aren't women stupid? They're also kind of, slutty. They're doing this because they're lascivious, which drives them to find these bad men. I don't find that in any other language, right? I look at songs in English and German and Italian and Dutch. You simply don't find that kind of blatant misogyny and mockery of women. And I want to know why. Why does France do this? What is going on in 19th century France that this seems okay? Guys are murdering women everywhere else, and they're chopping them up and they're doing horrible things to their bodies, but people are just horrified everywhere else. And I'm trying to, if I find a reason why that might be happening.